So this is how it begins. Luckily for the both of us, this job comes with instructions. Shall we? Another day arrived, another story to share. Meet Robert Norwood. Sometime in the year 1909, somewhere in New York City. This is his story, and his story begins like this. Robert Norwood, 38 years old, was a rather fussy man. If he had had any friends or acquaintances, they certainly would have said he was a bit particular about the things he liked and very vocal about the things that he did not. In Robert's world, which, in this case, consisted of a small townhouse in the lower parts of Manhattan, everything had to be exactly as he liked it. Unfortunately for Robert, things very seldom were. Until recently, Robert had considered himself a Boston man and proud of it. But upon the death of an uncle and the sudden inheritance of $2,000, one townhouse in a just so-so Manhattan neighborhood, and with it, one ancient old lady he was obligated to refer to as grandmother, Robert, his wife Marie, and their young children, whose names had very little importance on this story, suddenly found themselves a newly minted New York family. And by God, did Robert hate it. Robert hated the way the city smelled. He hated the way the people talked. He hated the way the people dressed. He hated the way the ground felt beneath his boots. He even hated the way the sun shined through the curtains of his new office, which resided in the newest bank on the newest street in New York. The only thing that was to Robert's liking was the nice little paycheck from said bank that he received. But even that had started to grow old. After all, a man like Robert deserved bigger and better things than a small office job, didn't he? If there was one thing that Robert by far hated the most, however, it was the streets and the people who constantly clogged them up. Nothing could sour Robert's mood faster than a glimpse or sudden noise from that grimy, nasty place full of vermin. Robert's words, mind you. Even just the memory of a dirty child playing on the sidewalk, or a man pulling a cart through the muck, would completely ruin Robert's appetite for the entire week. "Go home, cretins," Robert wished to shout from his window, "and stop disrupting the tranquility of mine." "Oh, Robert," his wife, Marie, would reply, "and what of the ones who don't have homes to go to?" "Well, that is some exceedingly poor planning on their part," Robert would mutter, before turning back to his evening newspaper. Of course, grandmother, who had found that Robert very rarely said anything she liked, had to deposit her 2 cents on the matter. "You should know poor planning," she would say to him.
"Your mother planned rather poorly when she had you."
Robert paid little attention to what Marie or his grandmother thought. So long as there was coffee in his morning cup and eggs on his plate, he seldom thought about the two at all. Even the other bankers at work found Robert hard to enjoy. He had no interest in the cinema or the vaudeville shows, and would question the sanity of anyone who stepped foot in such a place. Robert didn't like strolls through the parks, or meals served on used china, or trips to the Hamptons. As such, Robert was very rarely invited anywhere. Not that he seemed to care. Taking all of this into account, it was a very surprising, very unordinary day when Robert found something he did like. Luckily for Robert, that day was today. As his carriage bumped along the road, passing by the street merchants and the newspaper buildings on his way to work, Robert, like usual, was in a rather bitter mood. Stepping into the street, he sneered at the passers-by. He turned up his nose at offers to buy a paper from the Sun from the street corner newsboy. Didn't this boy recognize the insult of his words? That Robert was clearly a Times man? Robert, about to issue what was sure to be a biting remark, was caught off guard by a portly man who suddenly shoved a newspaper in Robert's face.
He's here. Today. Gonna fly over the water.
The portly man crowed. "Excuse you," Robert replied. "We'll be right," the man responded, though Robert hadn't asked. "His big demonstration flight is today. See?" He shook the newspaper in Robert's face, featuring a front-page photograph of the aviation man. Not waiting for Robert's response, the portly man continued to barrel down the street, shaking his newspaper in a few shocked faces. Robert glanced at the front door of his workplace, then back in the direction of where the man had disappeared. A flight over the harbor? What an imbecilic idea, Robert scoffed. Imbecilic or not, Robert soon found himself in a place he never thought he'd be, standing amongst the throngs of people, all awaiting a glimpse of Wilbur Wright's flight. "I won't be able to stomach a bite for a week after this," Robert boo-hooed to himself. Suddenly, gasps emitted from the crowd as hands shot up in the air, pointing at something unseen from Robert's eyes. "Where is it?" Robert cried, suddenly worried he had missed the whole thing. Just then, a wooden aircraft soared through the air. Far above the crowds, the machine looked positively minuscule in the sky. The people on the ground oohed and awed as the flying machine circled the Statue of Liberty. Robert, despite his best attempts at apathy, was just as enamored as everyone else. That night at dinner, Robert could think of little else than this flying machine. How gracefully it had soared through the sky, far above the disturbing hustle and bustle of the streets below. If Robert had that kind of machine, he'd never have to step foot again in the disgusting streets of New York City. "That's it! I shall fly!" Robert exclaimed suddenly at the otherwise silent dinner table. "It's finally happened. He's lost his last marble. Not that he had many to begin with," Grandmother quipped. "Oh, hush, you old windbag," Robert replied. "I've already made up my mind, and once my mind's made up, nothing can stop me from getting what I want." Marie and Grandmother exchanged an unsure glance as Robert leapt up from the table. "Do not disturb me for any reason," Robert exclaimed as he exited the room and made his way to his study. Robert, who was an okay banker and an exceedingly terrible husband and father, quickly discovered that he was a shockingly proficient inventor. Working through the night, Robert took an old bicycle and used it as the base of his flying machine. Reclaiming wood from the baseboards and fabric from the curtains, Robert put together a set of mechanical wings. Robert worked for several days and nights on his invention. He seldom left his study but for plates of eggs and cups of coffee. Despite growing concerns from Marie, Grandmother, and his place of employment, Robert kept working. At night, when there was but a few stray souls left roaming the streets, Robert took his flying machine out for tests. At first, his machine seemed an absolute failure. It bounced down the uneven road, gaining not even a foot of airborne flight before the machine's wheels would ultimately come crashing back down to meet the ground. Drat! Robert exclaimed with each failed attempt. Even Robert's neighbors, who, like many, disliked most everything about him, they began to grow concerned for his sanity. The local doctor even made a house call upon hearing multiple worried complaints about a madman running through the streets. No amount of concern or ridicule could surpass Robert's determination to be right. Donning his workday suit and his spit-shine boots, Robert reached for his flying contraption one more time. I shall head to work today, Robert decided, and I shall do it over top the heads of everyone and everything. Heading out into the busy street, Robert was quite the sight to see. Men and women gawked at his unkempt hair and odd bicycle. Spotting a break in the crowded road, Robert ran beside his flying machine for a few paces and then leapt on. Pedaling hard, the mechanical wings of the machine slowly began to flap up and down. Barreling toward and through an intersection, Robert just barely avoided collision with wandering commuters and carriages. Still, Robert did not stop. As the wings flapped up and down, Robert pedaled with all his might. Glancing around, Robert noticed something peculiar. He was suddenly at eye level with a fluffy white cat in a townhouse window. A third-story townhouse window. Robert looked down and realized there was now 30 feet between his boots and the street, and the distance was growing. I've done it, Robert giddily exclaimed. Robert turned his flying machine, soaring past the windows of his own townhouse at which Marie and grandmother sat, mesmerized by the sight of Robert in the air. See what you can achieve with careful planning, grandmother, he boasted as he flew past. Turning again, Robert headed in the direction of the bank. He passed over top of busy streets and buildings, enjoying, for the first time, the cool air and warm sun of New York City. From below, onlookers pointed and gasped at the sight of Robert so high up in the sky. By all means, stop and stare, Robert yelled down, for you people will never experience something as glorious as this. Spotting his bank off in the distance, Robert began his descent back down to earth. It was nice while it lasted, he sighed. If he could have, Robert would have stayed up there all day. Pulling the brake lever, Robert's flying machine began to slowly drift closer and closer to the ground. All was well. Until Robert found himself eye to eye with the 8th story of the Herald newspaper building, as a gust of wind blew under the wings of his machine. Suddenly, Robert's contraption was sent into a spin. Robert yelled as he flew head over bottom, wildly out of control. He yanked the handles of the machine, which proved to only make him spin faster. Another gust of wind blew, dropping Robert and the machine an additional 10 feet. The hustle and bustle of the street down below paused as passers-by, carriage drivers, and even the carriage riders all turned their heads up to look at Robert. They gasped in shock as he narrowly escaped falling off his machine and onto a nearby building. Let her go, yelled a man from the street as Robert continued to spin this way and that on the machine. We'll catch you, another man exclaimed as he unfurled a bolt of fabric. Other men grabbed on, forming a makeshift landing spot. I will do no such thing, Robert screamed from the sky. He had worked hard to create his flying machine, and he would rather die than to fall into the hands of those disgusting people. Robert and his machine blew this way and that. Then, all at once, the wind seemed to stop, and Robert and the machine were righted once again, still a good 15 feet in the air. Ah! Robert yelled. See? I'm perfectly fine. I don't need the help of you dirty, good-for-nothing little... As if to shut him up, a gust of wind blew right at that moment. It lifted the wings of Robert's machine, sending him and it even higher into the air. Robert spun yet again, unaware of where he was heading, or what he was heading towards. With a sudden and sickening crunch, Robert and the machine made an abrupt impact with the walls of the Sun newspaper building. Mothers down below shielded the eyes of their children as, not 10 seconds later, what remained of Robert and the machine tumbled to the ground below. The city coroner was called quite promptly, and by noon the spot on the sidewalk that Robert had left had most have been cleared away. "What a mess," said the chief officer assigned to the case, as he looked down upon where Robert had met his end. "And all over our beautiful streets." The next day proved to be an easy and profitable one for the Sun, as they hadn't needed to look very far for the next story. Newsboys circled up and down the streets, crying the front page headline to all: "Man flies too close to the sun." Well, that was something. And Robert seems to have agreed with us, seeing as how he has flown the coop. Anyway, more instructions. Another day done, another chapter complete. It'll take much more than one reading to find what you seek. That's a little ominous. See you soon. Good night. Now get some sleep.